And welcome back. You're listening to Keith Bengelli here and Nick Lahuri at Islands at War, our podcast programme on the occupation of the Channel Islands, mainly the bailiwick of Guernsey, but also bringing Jersey into the conversation if they merit it. We're now focusing on July 1940. And I'll just say hello to Nick.
Hi, Keith. Good to be back.
And Nick is going to describe the ramifications of the German air raid on St. Peter Port in June 1940, June the 28th, which really put in train the whole start of the occupation. So what we know is that the German bombers bombed the tomato trucks. Quite a few people were killed.
Yeah, they, as I mentioned on the previous episode, people crawled under their trucks for safety. Unfortunately, a lot of the trucks were set on fire because they were not only bombing but strafing both the harbour and other parts of the island as well. I know you know a gentleman that who's no longer with us, sadly, but he was out digging potatoes, I think you said.
Yes, good old Ronnie Sabir. He's sunk to rest a few years ago, but yes, he was out in the north of the island and could hear the raid and see the raid taking place, and a stray German aircraft shot them up when they dived in the hedge, and later on he said, my skipper came along and told me it was time to give it in for the day. And in fact, my a friend of mine I went to school with, he told me that his mother and his aunt both dived under one of the trucks and was pulled to safety, and both lived well into their 90s, and so that, you know, they were there. And he said a family relative was working on a crane in the harbour and was blown out into the water and survived that. But it was a cataclysmic event.
It was, yeah. 34 people killed, 33 injured, but I've seen varying numbers for the injured because I believe that there were many people that didn't seek, official medical treatment. People, improvised. It must have been pretty difficult then. There were a couple of ships in the harbour, armed only with a single Lewis gun. There is an account of one of the Lewis guns opening up, but it's not going to be much use against 6 Heinkel 111s. Although that's a very brave person that stands on the deck of a ship firing a Lewis gun, because opening fire on them is going to bring fire on you.
Yeah, because this to say the raid came out of the blue, it literally did just come out of the blue, and people weren't expecting this sudden cataclysmic event. I should mention that one of the people that one of the academics has written so well on the island, a lady called Madeleine Bunting, actually wrote a work of fiction called Island Song. It's well worth reading. A great tale about German the war with Germany, and also impinges upon or draws in the story of the occupation of the Channel Islands, and it opens with an fictitious account of the raid. But yeah, so we have this Friday night, tomato trucks, this cataclysmic event, as I say, but the ship still got away out of the harbour and took some evacuees away.
Yeah, that was basically the last boat that left. They were the last to go, and this caused people to realise the Germans were definitely coming. Various accounts that I've read have said that was the moment when everyone realised the Germans were coming. Yeah. Well, there'd been a weird. So we talked about in the last episode that there was kind of a state of panic all around the
twilight zone.
Yeah, about the evacuation. I mentioned the fact there was a massive increasing in car accidents and lorries crashing and things because people were rushing around in a panic. And then it just the week after, the week between the final ship going officially for the evacuation ships came in various guises. So you had the official ones, which were sent over by the British government. They stopped about a week before the air raid, and then there were other ships. The mail boat kept going. You could get on that and book yourself a trip to the UK. to get out, and things were going back to normal. There's one account, a chap that escaped from Guernsey in September 1940. He worked at the harbour, and he talks about cycling to and from his house in the north of the island, and it being strangely quiet, and just things kind of going back to normal. And then all of a sudden, this air raid happens.
Yes, I mean the air raid as well. Wasn't the aftermath wasn't pretty. I read some of the reports of the injuries, and of course in those days people didn't have telephones, and so they were trying to find out what had happened to members of the family that never returned home that night. And there were morgues sort of spread around the island because there was the cottage hospital, etc. So St. Peter Port Hospital. So it took a long time, almost between 12 and 24 hours for people to find out if they'd lost relatives. And the other problem was, of course, is that anybody that was caught up in one of the trucks, the kindest thing to say that there was very little to be able to attribute identification to. So this is on the Friday night, Nick. This is on the 28th of June. So we overnight now into the Saturday. The Germans, they didn't arrive on the Saturday apart from piecemeal. Can you just talk us through that?
Yeah, so on the Saturday, a German pilot came up. Three German aircraft came over, were flying around, trying to work out what was going on here. And then one of them landed at the airport because he saw that there was nothing really going on at the airport. Got out, had a bit of a look around. I believe he wandered around for about half an hour. Couldn't find anybody at the airport. It's probably worth mentioning that all the radio equipment from the airport had actually been removed by one gentleman in great presence of mind. Decided to remove it from the airport so that it couldn't be used.
Guernsey civilian?
Yes. His name eludes me for the moment, but it might come back to me during the course of the discussion. And he took that away. While the German aircraft was on the ground and the other two were flying around, some Bristol Blenheims came over and decided to open fire on those aircraft. So the chap that was on the ground decided it was best to get back in his plane and hot-footed.
Okay, so airborne British planes engaged German planes that were on the ground.
And the two that were still flying around. He thought he'd best get out of there. Yeah. The Germans released some publicity that when that happened, a couple of Blenheims were shot down. It doesn't appear that they actually were. It was just propaganda. So those aircraft returned to their base on the Cherbourg Peninsula, reported what they'd found. The Germans were actually planning to come across and invade by sea, but once this had been reported, they changed their mind and decided to arrive by air.
Okay, so before we get into that, what I wanted to ask you then is, it's not a spoiler to say that we were, this is the start of an occupation that lasted until May 1945. But Nick, why were we occupied? What was the point of what was in the Germans' mind when they took the opportunity to land forces throughout the bailiwick of Guernsey and obviously additionally in Jersey? What was in their mind militarily?
Militarily, it was propaganda, really. Also potentially seen as maybe a base to launch, other operations as part of the proposed invasion of England, that they perhaps would be some use. Although I'm not convinced that they really thought there was any strategic use apart from the fact that it was propaganda. They were able to take so many films here and pictures, and you see if you do a search on the internet, there's loads of pictures with German soldiers or German Luftwaffe crew, wandering around with all the British signs, advertising signs up, and things like that.
With Jersey and Guernsey policemen, but for all intents and purposes, British bobbies.
Yeah, exactly. They're wearing a uniform that looks just like a British bobby. and those were shown. So I mean, some of the Germans that arrived actually thought they were in the Isle of Wight.
Yes, I've heard that many times.
They didn't really know where they were, and they could basically spin the message with the pictures. Now, the idea of fortifying the islands didn't come until much later.
No, we'll talk about that, because I always talk. When I'm talking to people, I always explain that there were essentially two types of fortification. There was the initial, and then there was, which we'll get into, 1942 or so. So, Nick, nobody could then show me a German sort of strategic aim to take the Channel Islands. It doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist.
It was an opportunity, and they just basically took it. And of course, it was all bound up in this notion that they would come to some accord, or the Germans would come to some accord with the British. Our real enemy, of course, is Russia, because at the time they hadn't signed the Ribbentrop Pact. So the Germans and the Russians weren't in bed with one another yet, were they?
No, they were. They were in bed with each other.
That came right from 39,
right from the get-go.
Yeah, and so. Okay, so we move into the Sunday, and how do the Germans start then to arrive?
They arrived by air. So if you've watched any World War II films, the three-engine ones that look like they're made out of corrugated iron, Ju-52s, they arrived in those. Some of which brought things like motorcycles with them as well. And that's basically how they arrived.
Yes, I remember talking to a chap called George Brewer from La Pelotterie area of St. Peter's. St. Peter's in Guernsey is an area near the airport. It's 300 foot. It's the Highlands of Guernsey. It's a parish that sits on the cliffs. The first he knew of the occupation is he was cycling on the Sunday evening, and a column of German troops were walking away from the airport, and he thought, oh well, they're here. Yeah,
absolutely. There's loads of accounts of people the first time that they saw them. I mean, some people didn't see them until the next day, but by the 1st of July, sort of the afternoon of the 1st of July, there were quite a few accounts where people were saying they're everywhere, which is a bit tricky because there are 469 of them. So, well, in Guernsey anyway.
But it's like the arrival of some aliens. It's like in a Hollywood film where the aliens are here, and these Germans with their coal scuttle helmets and grey uniforms are then glimpsed, and of course the rumour mill goes in. But they were really here. So when they first arrived, what sort of troops and what sort of officer class came over?
Well, because the German government basically wanted to. They were still thinking about having peace with the UK, so they wanted to have. I don't like using the term a model occupation, but that is exactly what they were wanting to do. So
slightly less aggressive.
So they sent generally well-educated officers. The Commandant's Chief of Staff, Dr. I'm going to murder this name now. I think his name's pronounced Mass.
Mass, yeah, something.
So his he was a graduate of Liverpool University, and indeed his wife was English, although they'd lived in Germany for some time. But it was those type of people. A lot of them were academics, so. They were under orders to behave themselves when they were here. So, well, certainly initially, anyway.
Yes, because again, just to sort of look back on the raid, there was an assumption by and this is not excusing anything, of course, but the demilitarisation of the islands had not been conveyed to the Germans, as the British claimed for decades. That I think the usual route was that. If I remember clearly, the British were supposed to tell Joe Kennedy, the ambassador to the UK, the American ambassador to the UK, that was JFK's father, he was supposed to tell the US embassy in Berlin, and they were supposed to tell the Germans, but the Americans weren't told in the first instance at all. So the Germans generally didn't know that the islands had been demilitarised. The tomato trucks were canvas-backed trucks, and so the Germans naturally thought they were troop. So it was a military operation as opposed to an indiscriminate bombing of civilians. Would that be an accurate depiction?
That is. It's mostly agreed now that the Germans didn't know until the next day. The British were holding out because they had a bit of a difficult situation on their hands, because they didn't want to announce it too soon, because then they couldn't get people out. But equally, they didn't want something like this bombing raid to happen. So they were sort of balancing on a knife edge as to when to do it, because they didn't want to openly advertise straight away that the Germans could just basically, walk straight into the Channel Islands.
Yeah, because we've established then there was no German strategic aim. There was no great strategic use for the Channel Islands. So they arrived. A limited amount of troops and officers, an officer class that was well disposed to the British. Okay, but this is not just a bunch of Boy Scouts arriving. The local papers that were issued free the next day, which was on Monday the 2nd of July. Right?
Monday the 1st.
Monday the 1st of July, yep. And they were issued free, the Guernsey Press, notably, and it contains the initial German regulations and the Commandant's orders. Can you run through some of those?
Yeah, I mean, it starts off, basically, any trouble, you'll be bombed. The Germans basically said, if there's any trouble...
So don't say you weren't warned.
If there's any trouble, we will just bomb the islands, which they could have easily done. They could have pulled out and just bombed the living daylights out of us. So the next order was that spirits were to be locked up, and you were not allowed to sell spirits. No person was to enter the airport. All weapons had to be handed in, and this is a little bit bizarre because
all sorts of stuff was handed in.
they made you hand in all sorts of things. People were taking things that who they'd had relatives that had taken part in the Boer War and something like that, and maybe had a spear or something like that, and they had to go and hand those in. Air rifles, absolutely anything. It was. So some people were allowed to keep some of those things. I think it depended who was actually doing the collecting of them at the Royal Hotel. Some of them may have taken a slightly more pragmatic.
And the opposite of that is that some stuff was never handed in and was only found in latter years. I mean, my brother was renovating his first house in the 1980s, and he took part of the ceiling down, and his 2 dueling pistols fell on top of him, which he handed in to the police.
yeah, absolutely. No, some people just chose to hide stuff. Some people forgot about it after the war, to be honest. So from time to time things do turn up. One of the other more important ones was all service personnel to surrender. So any British personnel in...
so these would have been people that were caught here. They were on leave. Yeah. Essentially, they were on leave, weren't they?
Yeah, and what happened was they got locked up in Castle Cornet initially, before they were shipped off to POW camps. There was one chap, I wrote an article about him, which is on the blog, and he was a corporal, and he managed to he made the decision that there was no way he was surrendering. So what he did was he actually destroyed his uniform, he burnt it, put on civilian clothes, and basically managed to pass himself off as a civilian for the entire war. One thing that is quite funny is once the Germans introduced registration and ID cards, he actually one of the questions was, when did you leave the British forces? Obviously trying to capture people that capture's probably not the right word. Obviously trying to get an idea of people who maybe served in the First World War or in the 1930s, that sort of thing. But on his form, he actually put, I think it was the 8th of July. It was certainly about a week after they'd arrived, on his registration form, and clearly nobody noticed. He was issued with his ID card, and he lived at various different addresses around the island, but he was back here on leave.
The Germans did have a list, and I tell you how I knew that, or know that, is because I mentioned already my grandfather returned to the Royal Navy in 1939, but for some reason the Germans thought he was still here, or they checked out the address of where servicemen had lived, and they went to the my family home, which was in the Villanfry area in St Martin's. And of course, where's grandfather? They said, well, he's gone back. They searched the house and found his old uniforms. This then made the Germans think that he hadn't gone back, and the family were put under a bit of pressure until somebody was able to come and prove that he'd gone back to the Royal Navy in 1939. Okay, so the Germans now, excuse me, did they take any steps to, they presumably checked out places like Fort George, the Beaucamp militia headquarters?
Yeah, they you know, they were fairly active in trying to pick people up. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it wasn't that many. But it was, as you say, mostly people that were just trapped here. Because they'd come here on leave and we're still here when the bombing.
And they were imprisoned at Fort George, etc., before going off to
Castle Cornet initially. And
Castle Cornet,
and then they were shipped off to POW camps
for the rest of the war. And what about initial fortifications? Did the Germans think that once they'd arrived that the British might react instantly, or militarily in the first, like come and bomb them or attack them? What was their first sort of fortifications? Because this is quite distinct from the Atlantic War, which we'll get on to much later.
Very much so. They were worried that that people would actually try and escape to give information to the British, so they banned all fishing boats and any other boats, in fact, from leaving the harbour. Because they thought, they might go and give information away about troop dispositions, etc., especially given that there weren't very many of them here at that point. So they were genuinely worried about that. So, but they weren't, there were no concrete structures built. They they did use some of the existing fortifications around the island, but it was mostly, machine gun pits and things like that were dug.
Mortar pits and things.
Yeah.
So we'll go on to talk about that as in future episodes. So we've got now the commandant's orders to our government, to our police force, and to the civilian population that remained here. And then the Germans sort of started to move around the island, and we read in some of the diaries. Probably a good point to sort of pick out the fact that we're our sort of texts that inform these episodes are taken from diaries and that were written during the war, and academic books, and not just dry academic books, some really good historical accounts that took place after the war, written after the war or such. I'm just interested to read some of the things that might strike us as a bit odd. I look here, Reverend Ord, who wrote a very good diary called Guernsey Occupation Diaries, imaginative title, 1940 and 1945, edited actually by the actor and historian John Nettles. Ord writes, it was instructive to see Germans eating butter in half-pound packets without bread as they went about the streets. Germans are everywhere, Ord writes, eating, ordering omelettes made with 8 eggs at a time. So they were gorging themselves on what they saw as the sort of bounty of war, but they were paying for this. Just explain how the Reichsmark became our sort of currency here.
So they were paying for the goods in Reichsmarks, but they weren't your normal Reichsmarks. So they couldn't spend them in Germany. They were being paid in special notes that were printed. So you can kind of see why they want to spend them here. But also they were buying things like clothing and stuff like that and sending it back to their family in Germany.
Now, of course, there was some rationing for the population, the civilian population, anyway. But then the Germans come and start spending this almost worthless money, And that exacerbated things, didn't it? Accelerated the shortages. There was no sort of control on the Germans, and I must make the case here that they weren't looting.
No,
they were buying, and there was no constraint put on that.
Yeah, exactly. They were just buying things up. I think Ord talks at one point about it, the town being like a giant tuck shop, and they're like school kids. Running around buying everything they can. Now, some shopkeepers were a bit crafty and kept stuff back and didn't have it on display so that they could keep supplying their customers. But what happened was the shops just started to run out of things very quickly because, of course, they couldn't get replacements for a lot of this stuff. So that caused severe problems. But yeah, the rations were cut as well, as you mentioned. So 2 days a week there was to be no meat in the schools where they were supplying meals, and they were already things were getting quite tight for the local population.
In July 1940, and the aim is to take the occupation month by month in these programmes that will go out fortnightly. If you've got any comments or queries, Nick will be the one that solves any queries that you have. occupied@gnetradio.com if you wish to email into us. We have a Facebook page.
We do indeed. So if you search for Islands at War, you'll be able to find that.
And Nick runs an incredibly detailed and informative blog. And Nick, you will give some information at the end of this program.
I will do.
Yeah. Okay, so now, Nick, I want you to explain to the listeners how the Germans came in. They needed to work with our local government. Well, one of the things they do is they reduced it in size.
Yeah, so a controlling committee had been formed actually just before the Germans arrived. It was formed on the 25th of June, so before the bombing raid. Effectively a form of management by an emergency committee, as probably the best way of describing it, and that had some senior people on the committee, including Ambrose Sherwell, who was the first president of the committee, and they basically had executive power and administration powers of the states of Guernsey, which is our parliament, would be the best description of it.
So smaller government.
Yeah.
And they moved to Elizabeth College, didn't they?
They were based in Elizabeth College, yeah. They also had the interesting situation that obviously if they were passing any laws, well, you couldn't get them approved by the Crown because you couldn't send them off to the UK, because all of our laws get approved by the Privy Council in the UK, so they couldn't send them to the Crown. So the Germans very kindly decided that in order to resolve that problem, they would look after approving the laws, any laws that the states, the controlling committee wanted to implement. But equally, it didn't work the other way around. The Germans said, if we give you any laws, you will register them on your civil register of laws in Guernsey. Okay,
so the Germans want to talk to the civilian population. They effectively tell our government what you're going to do. That there was a man in the middle here. This is Louis Guillemet,
yes,
who we've already discussed, very important person. He has a diary that comes on stream in 1941, so we'll start to take his views into consideration when we are in 1941.
Yep.
Now, we have a smaller government. They then pass these decrees down to the population. One of them was that the states took control of the greenhouse industry here. So it should be explained to people that we had two economic drivers in the islands, and one was tourism, which obviously now is finished, and the other was the export of tomatoes. Now we're actually talking in a tomato packing shed, which is now converted to my studio. So the Germans were actually in the room that we were in at the moment. We know that they visited here, and in order to control the vestiges of the tomato crop, but then really having no export market, they just couldn't get rid of the tomatoes, could they?
Yeah, they had a massive problem. It turned out to be a year that it was a bumper crop when you couldn't actually send them anywhere. So the German commandant ordered the destruction of half of the tomato crops, because without a way of preserving those, they'd perish, and they'd have the problem of getting rid of them. So yeah, there was a bumper crop. So about 2,000 tons were destroyed.
And I know that the people that were tenants here in the house that I own, which is very much part of this the land and property that I own, they, although the gentleman, Mr. Lepedvin, died in 1942, his widow, Rachel Lepedvin, she went on to secure war reparation in 1945, certainly from our government, to the tune of £542. Okay, so the government also introduced fuel rationing. There is the first horse-drawn bus makes an appearance in July.
One of the first orders from the commandant was that all fuel and spirits for motor vehicles were to be you had to get a permit, because they were to be for essential things only. So unless you were a doctor or certain tradesmen, bakers and people like that had to deliver around the island initially, you needed a permit. So things had to innovate a little bit and go back to using horse-drawn vehicles.
The car ownership was very much professional classes only.
Yeah,
really.
exactly.
Everybody walked or took the bus. The trams had been gone 6 years earlier. It was push bike or walking for most people, or buses. Okay, so and then farming and fishing rules. Fishing in particular was curtailed unless you had a German escort.
Yeah, so
a soldier on the boat with you.
I'm not sure that it was a requirement to have a German soldier on the boat at that point. I think that was later on, after some of the escapes in September 1940. But what happened was when they allowed the fishing boats to go out again, after the initial ban on any fishing, they sent out German boats with them. They were only allowed out 2 miles from the coast, and if you deviated from where you were supposed to be fishing, they'd be chasing you up in one of their launches and making sure that you were back where you were supposed to be, or send you back to the harbour. Now,
we're really in the first few weeks of the occupation, and the British decide to act, and so we know that Churchill starts the ball rolling about getting people here. So Nick, can you talk us about he reaches out to, or not reaches out, tells Ismay. You can explain who Ismay was, and then we have the origins of Operation Anger and Operation Ambassador. If you could talk us through from the start through, because it's really a very movable feast, what they wanted to do to what they actually did, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, Churchill was all for taking back the Channel Islands straight away, which would have been interesting, having just left, because of for all of the reasons we discussed in the other show about it being too difficult to protect the islanders themselves in the event of any attack. So he very quickly orders Ismay to get on with an operation to find out what was going on. It got scaled back to that sort of thing, and this is just remarkable. I mean, we get to they called the Operation Anger, which I think is probably fairly apt, because Churchill was absolutely furious, having not wanted to abandon the islands in the first place and had to be persuaded that was the only option. So things get underway very quickly, and we were talking about this just before we came on air. It's amazing. The first briefing for Operation Anger takes place on the 4th of July. And that's
so the Germans had been here just hours in some respects.
Well, yeah, exactly. They were still coming into the island. The Guernsey had been invaded on the 30th of June. So they'd already found a chap called Hubert Nicol, a Guernseyman, and they briefed him on the 4th of July as that he was to conduct Operation Anger. He came on his own on a submarine, H-43, which was built completed just after the First World War. It wasn't, the most up-to-date submarine,
Nicol is a Guernseyman.
Yeah, Hubert Nicol, Guernseyman.
And his rank was lieutenant?
Yes.
Lieutenant.
Yeah, lieutenant. Hubert Nicol, who actually I met him many times because he quite often was involved in starting things like the swimming race at my old school. Little did I know at the time, when being 11, 12 years old, that the chap firing the starting pistol was actually the chap that had come to the islands and done all of this. But to show how hastily they conducted this operation, they actually got him a collapsible canoe, but they just went out and bought one from Gamage's, the store in London. And this was a bit of a blessing and a curse, this collapsible canoe, is when they got here on the submarine H-43, they duly built the canoe, and then they tried to get it through the hatch and discovered it wouldn't actually fit. So they were going back down into the submarine from outside, and one of the sailors, the submariners, accidentally let slip a large metal hatch, which created a massive bang.
A big sonar.
They were on the surface, but just the sheer noise of it when they were anchored. Not anchored, but they were just off of the Guernsey coast where they were going to land Nicol, and they've just basically announced their arrival. Fortunately for them, nobody actually realised what it was. So they rebuilt the canoe outside the boat, and he came ashore at Legeno Bay, was able to move around freely because the Germans weren't very organised yet. No ID registration cards.
I mean, he was pretty well briefed in what he had to do, didn't he? Because he went out to people he knew by the airport.
Yep.
Borrowed a bicycle. You haven't seen me, have you?
Yeah, exactly.
Sort of thing.
He went all around the perimeter of the airport. He went to his parents' home, remarkably, given that the Germans were looking for British forces personnel. But one of their neighbours and friends actually worked for a baker, and was able to tell him that there were 469 Germans in Guernsey at that point.
What an incredible piece of luck to actually come into contact with someone who knew exactly the information that he wanted.
Exactly. And I should say that this landing took place on the 8th of July, so 9 days after the occupation. He got away. A couple of days later, he was picked up. Then two other chaps, Mulholland and Martel, arrived for part 2 of Operation Anger.
Again, Mulholland and Martel, local men, lieutenants in the British Armed Forces.
Yes. Yep. And they were briefed by Nicol before he left, when he met them when they came ashore. And Nicol went back to the UK.
And it should be said that they were about 20, 21, 22. They were very young men.
Yeah, absolutely. And they were picked for their knowledge of the islands and the fact that they could move around freely. So then we moved on to the whole point of Anger was to get ready for Operation Ambassador, which was to take place. This was led by Lieutenant Colonel Durnford Slater, who was running the small-scale raiding force, which we'll talk about in some future episodes because they were fairly active around the Channel Islands. Interestingly, Durnford Slater was briefed by David Niven, the actor, who was currently working in military intelligence, giving up his career in the movies to join up, and he was involved in that. He features later on as well in something else relating to a raid around the Channel Islands for a future show. So they were supposed to meet Mulholland and Martel on the 13th of July. Didn't see them. The signal lamp was flashed, but they had to give up. However, they did take place, the landings. It was I'm not sure how to put this, not most successful operation. They arrived...
it was an anticlimax, really, wasn't it?
Yeah. We'll get to what Churchill said about it later. They came two destroyers, HMS Scimitar and HMS Saladin, with 6 RAF seaplane launches, which to accompany them. A couple of RAF Ansons with circle at low level. over the south coast, just to make noise, to cover up the fact that these guys were coming. The boats weren't really suitable for the purpose, and one of the first problems they had was compasses went awry on one of them, and they ended up in one of the other islands. It's not really clear which one it was. It was probably Herm or Little.
But they were undetected as well.
Yeah, they were undetected. They were completely lost, and they were found by chance on the way back by one of the Royal Navy ships. They could have ended up having to surrender. So that was the first party that had gone. There was a party that was landing at Point de la Moy, which is on the south coast of Guernsey, and gives pretty much a fairly short trip to Guernsey Airport. But as they hadn't seen the signal, they didn't go ashore. It's a shame, because they would have had rich pickings, because their task was to go to the airport and destroy German aircraft. There were between 30 and 50 German aircraft here at any one time during the June, July. So they would have, if they got ashore, been able to destroy some of those. And the final party ended up at Gnet Bay. They went up the cliff up to, if you're familiar with the island, up to Jerburg, near the Doyle Monument, and they blockaded the road with
someone's rock garden.
Someone's rock garden, yeah, some large bits of granite. And if you go up there today, just before you get to the Doyle Monument, just on the right-hand side, there's a house you can see into the driveway, and there's still some of that rock garden there. They had a bit of a problem because they just couldn't find any Germans. They were tasked with getting some Germans and taking them back. Couldn't find any. And in fact, Durnford Slater almost got shot by one of his own men, because they both jumped into a machine gun pit from different directions, and they thought that the other one was a German. But once they realised, they carried on. There was one of the party. There were 140 of them involved in this raid, so it was fairly big, but it was put together.
But how many actually came ashore? Nowhere
near that.
Yeah, that's right. So 140 were tasked with coming here,
yeah,
but about a third came ashore. Possibly
yes,
not even that much.
Yes, yeah. Something like that. But one of the party was Durnford Slater knew that they were actually running late to get back to the boat. But one of the party was really wanting to blow something up, but he was persuaded that wasn't a good plan. But they did cut some cables, which the islanders got blamed for. Now, they as they were going back down, it's a very steep cliff path to get
very
down
steep,
there.
Yeah.
Durnford Slater was running because they were running late to get back to the boat. His service pistol was cocked at the time, because obviously he wanted to be ready if they had encountered any Germans, and he tripped and it went off. So that was the only shot fired by the British forces.
No one was harmed, but the peace was the silence was broken, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some accounts which suggest that there might have been a little bit of machine gun fire off in the distance, but I'm not sure if that's correct. So they get back down to the beach. Now, bear in mind, this group had been put together very, very quickly. No one had actually checked that everyone could swim.
Yes, because there'd have been quite a tidal movement in the time they were shore.
Yeah. And so three of the guys had to fess up on the beach that actually we can't swim. Durnford Slater had to make a snap decision and said, "I'll send the Navy back for you, but you're going to have to go into hiding. They'll come back the next night and come and get you." So these guys, obviously the ones that had swum had to leave their kit on the beach. These guys went off into hiding, and actually I'm amazed where they ended up. A local lady on Twitter, Liz Walton, very kindly gave me some information for my blog about these chaps, because they found their way all the way down to the other end of the island to Torteville, and they actually hid with their aunt and uncle. And they hid out there for a few days, but were eventually captured somewhere near the airport.
They gave themselves up, and they were in uniform.
They were in uniform, but they were captured. They were walking down a road, and they were captured. But they were in uniform, so not really a problem from that point of view. They weren't going to be shot as spies.
And the reason I bring that up is because Martel and Mulholland were also still here, but weren't in uniform.
Correct.
Which of course meant they could have been shot by.
Well, and they were threatened with that
as spies.
Yeah.
So where we are with this, Nick, is that the raid is a failure, and we'll talk about in the next episode Churchill's response to this. But what we'll also carry over into the next episode and beyond that is the fact that Martel and Mulholland are stranded on the island.
They are.
And they haven't got a uniform, and it brings it in itself. It's a really, really interesting episode. So in the August edition of Islands at War, we'll update you on Mulholland and Martel. So thanks for listening. We've run a little bit over time, but it doesn't matter. And one of the things I want Nick to brief you on is how you can access his blog, which is called
it's called Island Fortress. So if you go to island-fortress.com, you will find a blog. It's not linear like the program. It covers all aspects of the occupation, from varying different time frames, being raids and things like that. I've got some things relevant to what we're talking about today, which I'll put on the Facebook page for Islands at War.
And if people want to communicate with you with regard to your blog, Island Fortress, there's an email address to get hold of you.
Yeah, there's the easiest way is actually to just to go to the website. There's a contact menu at the top. Just hit that, and you can send me an email from there.
So the full website address is
island-fortress.com.
Okay, and if you want to talk to Nick, or if you want to communicate with Nick and I with regard to Islands at War, this program that aims to cover every month the occupation of the Channel Islands, you can get hold of us at occupied@gnetradio.com. So in a fortnight's time we'll have recorded our August 1940 program. So between now and then, enjoy the 2 episodes, 3 episodes.
Yeah, 3 counting the pilot.
Yeah, 3 episodes that are up on Mixcloud. Go to www.gnetradio.com and listen again. So until we meet again, I'm sure somebody has said, it's goodbye from Keith and
goodbye from me.
Bye-bye.